Hi everyone, welcome to another of my webinar series. Today we're going to talk about middle blockers, explaining the important characteristics of middle blockers, and we're going to focus today on the blocking component of the role, some technical aspects, some mental aspects, some practice aspects as well, and as always with some videos to make it all a little bit more interesting and exciting. So let's kick it right off with our middle blocker. And the first thing that we always think about or consider in any position really is what are the personal qualities that each of the different positions requires, because they all have some small differences. So for the middle blocker, what we're looking for is somebody who is highly intelligent. And it's we're going to talk about this a few times as we go through, but it's let's call it a misconception that middle blockers are not intelligent. Middle blockers are, with setters, the most intelligent players on the court, at least the good ones are, as they have to follow the setter. They have to be inside the head of the setter and reading the game, understanding the game at essentially the same level to counter the qualities of the opponent's team setter. So we need to have in our middle blockers players who are very intelligent at looking at and understanding the game of volleyball. More than any other player position on the court, middle blockers have to be patient. They do the most. So when we study the game patterns, we learn that middle blockers actually are the ones that are more physically involved in the game, even if they sit down for typically for part of it. They do the most jumps. They're involved in the play, and they score the least points, basically. Middle blocker, the best middle blocker in the world, as I often say to my own middle blockers, the best middle blocker in the world would get not even one block per set. So it's a pretty low rate of success, and so a middle blocker needs to be very patient. And along with that, they need the ability to accept failure. They need to understand that they will succeed a really small proportion of the time. So an outside spiker, at least in the blocking part of it, an opposite or an outside, if they score 50% of their attacks, then everything's looking pretty good. But with a middle blocker, if they get score block points on 5% of their blocking attempts, then that's actually a really high percentage. So the failure rate is really high. And middle blockers also have to be prepared to take risks. They have to be prepared to do stuff like this. Which is essentially being prepared to look silly on a big stage, being prepared to not just to take that risk, but to accept the consequences of taking that risk, which in this case is one of the best spikers in the world getting the chance to score without a block. And a little technical problem. So next thing for middle blockers is the physical requirements. That's probably the first thing that we're going to look at with our middle blockers, but we go with the psychological part first. First thing, middle blockers, volleyball is a game with a net in the middle, so it doesn't matter how we look at it, but that size is important. and for middle blockers more than every other position. And that includes having long arms. And I would also probably include having big hands, because big hands is also an advantage in blocking. The arms are important, so the height, the reach is more important than the size, or than the top of your head. Obviously, I've remember in the past having a conversation with a coach at junior level who insisted that the side, the head part was more important because a taller person was more intimidating for the opponent's attackers. Needless to say, I didn't agree with it then, and I don't agree with it now. The arms, how far the arms are able to reach up and over the net, is decisive more than where the head is. Middle blockers need to be fast, and this is one key point. They need to be fast, especially laterally. They need to be able to cover basically 4 meters maximum, either left or right, as fast as possible. The technical requirements of the middle blocker position, obviously we're not going too far out on a limb here. The first thing that middle blockers have to be able to do is to block, and I would argue that the block has the highest priority. There are obviously, when we're putting together a team, obviously different players have different strengths and weaknesses, and some players will have a better attack than block, but all blockers have to be able to block well at some point. You can't have a middle blocker whose only job is to attack. It's when putting together a team, you can certainly have good balance by having one who is more a blocker and one who is more an attacker, but blocking is the priority. Attack, as we've already said, is less important, but is also an important part of the game. A middle blocker with good attack can affect the game, even when they're not actually touching the ball. We don't talk about this very often, but we should, and we're probably going to round off this webinar talking about this point again, but serve and defense are important for middle blockers as they are for all other positions. And one of the really negative parts of the introduction of the libero is the way that coaches have changed their idea of practicing as much as anything else. So a lot of coaches will ignore the serving and defense requirements of volleyball of the middle blocker. And we're going to swing back around to that towards the end. But needless to say, better serving and defending is important and has to be part of the considerations we make when we're choosing players and, more importantly, developing players. I've said that I started off by saying that middle blockers were the most intelligent players. They need to have a really high level of game understanding. And this will be a common theme, is that middle blockers have to be part of the game. And what I really dislike is when I watch games and I see coaches who have structured their tactics so that middle blockers don't have to do things. So, very complicated tactics so that the middle blocker never has to set or pass a free ball or anything like that. I think that that is only negative. And as much as anything else, even if it was the only thing, it is a demotivating factor for middles, which ends up having a negative effect on the game and the team. So we should avoid it. Game understanding, I want to expand on this a little bit. And this is obvious that volleyball is, as much as coaches would like it to be, volleyball is not only played in planned situations. In fact, depending on the level, and even at a high level, more than half of the game is played out of system. And that means that more than half of the game is played outside of set plays, where the first contact is outside the 3 meter line. Whether that's due to the poor quality of the players or the pressure from the other team, it means that if the attacking team doesn't have a system, then the blocking team, the defending team also doesn't have a system. So the players have to, the middles, and in fact, all players on the defending team have to be able to read and understand what's happening in those situations. Now, all players have to be able to thrive out of system, and especially middles. And the difference where middle blockers make the difference is in those plays. Anybody can jump or not jump when the coach tells them or otherwise, but the more than 50% of the game that happens outside of those, that systematic situation, is where the good middles and the difference-making middles come into their own. And this is a big thing that I'm really conscious of. It's not only about middles, but this is the topic of the day. So I never make or want to hear jokes about how he's only a middle, or they're only a middle, or what you expect from a middle. Those well-intentioned jokes, perhaps, even amusing at times, they have a negative effect on the players, and really specifically in reducing the expectations on the players. If nobody else has any expectations of a middle blocker, then there's no reason for the middle blocker to have expectations of themselves, or indeed to push themselves in practice, or get better at serving or defense, or bother even caring about setting a free ball or setting a high ball, if people are just going to make jokes of them anyway, or make jokes of them when they do make one. So it's a really big demotivating factor. Those what we think of as being witty asides, but in reality, they make our team worse. So today we're going to talk more or less exclusively about block. We'll come back and in a week or so and talk about attack, but really for today I want the focus to be just on the blocking part of the middle blockers trade, so to speak. So we start, of course, as we do with everything, which is with technique, and reading is the most important technical skill for the middle blocker. We talk about reading in two different contexts in blocking, and we sometimes confuse those two things. So one is the technical part of it that we're talking about right now, and the second one is the tactic of read blocking, and they have the same name. So we tend to think of them as being the same thing, or that reading is a tactic, but reading is the ground, the basis of blocking, is the basis of the technique of blocking. when we talk about reading in a tactical sense, it's a different thing, and it begins with reading. Even if we don't in the tactical part of it, we don't always react, which is the full name of the tactic, which is read and react blocking. So we need to make sure that we're clear on the distinction. Reading is the basis of the technical skill of blocking. I would contend pretty strongly that reading is more important than speed of movement. And just like setters, you'll find that in most cases, middle blockers mature, reach their peak after they get past 30 years of age, for example. And they're clearly not at the height of their physical abilities, but they get better at reading the game. And reading the game, reading the play, reading the setter means that you get to where you're going earlier. And being in a place at a particular time is the requirement, not the speed. And when we talk about the reading part of the blocking technique, we'll hear this mantra again and again, which is the I sequence for middle blockers and indeed for all blockers, which is where we need to look at each different part of the action. So we start by watching the ball that's played by the receiver. We then watch the setter, in particular the hands of the setter. After the contact of the ball, we watch the ball to see where it's going, if we indeed have to, and then we switch our focus to the spiker. And for the middle blocker, the key thing that we have to watch is the setter, because it's the setter that gives the middle blocker all of the big percentage of the information that they need to make decisions to be at the place they want to be at the right time. The ball, apart from the origin, or what ends up being the origin of the set, so where the reception goes, except for that, the ball essentially has no useful information. The ball is just an object that is literally just battered around by the participants. And so the things that we need to be paying attention to are the agents that act on the ball, and the setter and the spiker. And for the middle blocker, that's in most cases the setter, and certainly the most important agent that acts upon the ball. So with the technique, we start from the beginning and we start from our starting position. And these are the things that I talk about with my middles. Firstly, that we need to be balanced and comfortable. In a lot of volleyball techniques, we have very detailed instructions on how we want the player to start and where the toes need to be and the knees and the shoulders. And what we end up having is a really uncomfortable and unnatural position. And I believe that unnatural, uncomfortable positions don't lead to anything good. The player has to be comfortable in a way that's going to allow them to read, to see the action that they have to be, to make decisions and to execute their movement. I think that's much more important than if the angle of the toe is 44 or 48 degrees from parallel. I don't mind the legs to be wide apart as long as it's comfortable for the players. The reality is, with most of the guys that I'm working with who are big, we'll come to this in a minute, they only need to make a single cross step to cover the 4 meters that we talked about, and they can easily do that if the legs are, or if the feet are wider than the traditional shoulder width apart. And except perhaps on perfect reception, I don't mind, particularly if the hands are low. We have our example here, and this is perfect reception. I obviously think this is a pretty good position. People have done this study over the years, and even if the hands are held high above the net, that theoretically reduces the time between the setter's contact and being able to put your hands, put the middle blocker to put their hands on the ball. In reality, the act of jumping brings the hands down before they go over. So it's not, or it's certainly a much smaller difference than you might think of in theory. So that's a pretty good starting position there from Nemo. The next thing is the footwork. We have 2 basic footwork possibilities. I'm not going to go into massive detail on this, but we will see here so there we have Gustavo, the famous Brazilian. With all of these videos, normally if we were doing this in person, I would show it 3 or 4 times. But in this case, we're on video, so you can go back and watch it as many times as you want. So there's Gustavo with what's really a very classical footwork pattern going to the left. Here we're going to have Nemo in a very classical pattern going to the right. And getting the block. And here we're going to see James Weir with a short movement with a single cross step to the right. I had to leave in the transition ball. And here, a shuffle step to the right. Traditionally, I didn't need to leave in the transition there. Traditionally, the shuffle step has the advantage of keeping the form of the blocker's hands better, more parallel to the net, and a faster penetration over the net, and the negative of not being able to move long distances very fast, but for the short distance that we saw here, it's very effective, and his attention in transition could be better. With the technique, with the hand and arm work, so the next part, again, I'm not inventing anything here, and you can see this in a million places. The most important thing is to be on the other side of the net, and being high is not an advantage generally, but cutting the angle is the most important part. The angle, reducing the available angles for the spiker. I'm really big on the hands being straight over the net. There are some situations for outside blockers where we can do some different things with our hands in different situations, but for middles, I'm really strong on them having their right hand in front of the right shoulder, left hand in front of the left shoulder. It turns out that that's actually an incredibly difficult thing to do, because I don't know exactly why. I think perhaps because a lot of coaches want blockers to sweep their hands in one direction, or to push to the middle of the court or other things. I am not one of those coaches. I want the hands to be straight over the net, and also basically wherever the blocker ends up being. So in this case, Trent O'Dea, he's late, he doesn't make the position, but he forms a good block, good individual block wherever he is. And if you do that, you make the spiker have to make a play. My object in blocking is always that if the ball touches the blocker, then it goes to my team's advantage in some manner. And just to be clear, it's not that Trent O'Dea is the one who's always late, but it's the one who, when he is late, has the best form. Timing, as I like to say, everything is timing, and blocking even more so than everything else. The basic timing on a slowish to medium speed ball is that we jump after the spiker. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is to do with the relative difference in the jumps of spiker and blocker. So a jumper, because of the nature of the jump, is jumping higher, so reaches the peak at a different time after takeoff. Another really important reason for me is that spikers generally orient themselves with the block. So we think of spikers as spiking at the court, but in reality, spikers spike at the block. And especially on a high ball, when they're looking up, they don't know where they are in space necessarily until they see the block. And so for high balls especially, we want to block very late, and as the speed of the attack increases, then our timing can be closer to the takeoff point of the spiker. And here we're going to see triple block. And before I hit play here, the first point obviously is the timing, and we can also here, it's a really good example of the hand position for all three blockers that we just talked about. So with our triple block, we have the timing after the spiker getting faster as the speed of the ball increases, the speed of the set, until we come to the situation, the tactical situation that we talked about, where we want to commit, or in some languages it's called an option against the first tempo, where the focus is on stopping the first tempo. And in that case, we want to jump before the spiker. So we have our first case here. And this is intended to be a commit block, but is still too late. So he's still jumping after the spiker there. And a better example is this one, and that's the effect of the commit block, to be up early, that the spiker has no angles to be able to go past the block there. So that's the technical components of of blocking. So now we can think about how we practice those things, because it's one thing to know what to do. It's another thing to create the environment, to create the exercises, drills to get the outcome that we want. So firstly, we talk about footwork, and the most important thing with footwork, it's one part of volleyball where we need to get from a known point A to a known point B in the shortest possible time. So it's the one part of volleyball where we know exactly what our footwork can be and should be, and we can practice just that alone. And what's important is that we always do this with observation and correction on the part of the coach. So too often you'll see players practice their footwork, but they're doing things like they're not getting into a proper ready position, so they're not initiating their movement from the same base that they would be in a game. For me, it's important where their eyes are when they're practicing this, because if you're watching your feet, then okay, in the learning, the beginner part to watch the feet can be something, but while you're practicing your footwork, you should also be practicing looking in the place that you're going to be looking, because otherwise it's simply not the same movement. So here are a couple of drills that I use for exactly that. So the first one is a warm-up exercise. So one thing that I incorporate blocking and serving as it happens into the warm-up part of practice, because it tends to be a non-maximal jump, and so we can practice the footwork without the full speed jumps. So before we start spiking. So in this simple exercise, it's setters are having some repetitions, and the blockers are practicing their footwork because they know where the ball is going. So they're watching the setter at the right time to choose the timing, and then because they know where the ball is going to go, then they have their basic footwork. And in this exercise, they'll do 2 in a row, and we can go through this 4, 5, 8, however many times we want it to be. In the second version of this, so it's essentially the same, a variation of the same thing, but now we have 6 players, 6 against 6. So I do most of, essentially all of my training in some version of 6 players on each side of the net with different controls, which is something that you can learn about in a couple of my other webinars on practice and structuring practice, specifically the practice to play webinar, but I digress. So in this exercise, I will give the ball directly to the setter, and the blockers know where the ball is going. So it's a footwork exercise, but because we're playing volleyball, it's also practice for the spikers to spike against the block, practice for defense, practice for transition attack, and so on and so forth. And this is another point that I'll make later on when we're talking about training blocking, is that we have to be giving feedback for the players all the way along. So here you can see me, even if you can't hear me, talking about the two mistakes that happened, the two blocking mistakes that happened in this action. So the player in position 4 firstly didn't make the triple block, and then in the second counter-attack or the second counter-attack action, the middle blocker didn't close the triple block. So there's an example of the feedback that we have to be giving during practice when we're talking about blocking. We've said that reading is more important than speed. So we need to be really specifically and explicitly giving blockers feedback on the quality of their reading and on the sequence of their eye movements. So we need to be paying attention to where their eyes are focused at different times of the action, and we need to be giving them feedback on that. As in, you are looking at the wrong place at the wrong time, you need to be looking here, this is where the information is coming from. That's basically Moodle blocking in a nutshell. We have to always remember that players are outcome oriented, and this is especially an issue with blocking, because we've already said that a middle blocker will get a block point on 5% of their blocking attempts, or maybe even less. So we need to keep the players' attention on what's important and on the parts of the action, on the parts of the process that they need to be, rather than just if they didn't get the block. Because most of the time, that's what they're going to be thinking about is, we didn't get the block. I didn't get the block. So we can also practice reading outside of game form trainings. So the first drill that I showed before with the 3 blockers working together, we can just do the same version of that just with a middle blocker, just practicing watching the setter, and that's for me also a really important skill, or important way of practicing, and a way to incorporate more players in simple, let's say, simple drills. I don't like players working by themselves. And here's one more part of game understanding that we've talked about. I don't know that a lot of people talk about this, and I certainly don't know if there's a name for it, but I call it a read commit, where within a system of reading, there are specific game moments that require a commit block. And the example, one example is a low reception or a fast reception to particular parts of the court, where the setter really has no options. And that's that's essentially why I'm talking about middle blockers needing to be intelligent, needing to have a high level of game understanding, because that's what the really good middle blockers do, is they understand the game moments that are situational, in this case, that require a particular action. And we can help as coaches during gameplay by giving them feedback on exactly that. It's difficult to practice those things because they're situational, but encouraging them to make those decisions, giving them feedback on the information or that's around those situations, so that they can make really great decisions in the game. So for practicing game understanding, it's not an easy it's not an easy thing to do, but a couple of things that I do in my practices is practicing with tactical directions. I don't always do this, but I've definitely done it at different times where when we have a scrimmage, the middle blockers have tactical instructions that they have to carry out. Another one, reading the game is at a really simple level, looking at the right thing at the right time and being in a body posture, not position, but a body posture that allows you to make good movement. So as in the example in the short video that I showed before, the feedback giving to the player that in the rally, that they were not looking in the right position, or they were not, and this is the most common thing, is that they were not fast enough to get back into the starting position, and that is the best place to see the action. From once you're in that position, you can see the setter, you can see the play unfolding if that's what you need to do, who's in or out of the play, etc. And so we need to be giving the players feedback on those things, coaching the whole rally in effect, not just the first action. So I gave a little tiny taste of my basic training structure. This is a slightly longer version of it, and in this clip, I have the setter with specific instructions to make a choice between one or two play, or not one. You can't choose between one, but to choose between a couple of options, and the block and defense has to react to those. When I'm doing drills like this, especially, this is basically the learning, the improvement part of practice. I'm watching during the action where the blockers are looking, what they're preparing for, and I like to give feedback during the action. So if you go back, you can hear me reminding the blockers to look at the setter's hands, and in different moments, it'll be to come back to the middle, where you have to look now, what the options are, etc., etc. I find that a very effective way of getting them, of helping all the players, not just the middles, to understand. Understanding begins with looking in the right place and being in a position to respond to the information you take in and the decision that you make. So some things about tactics now. So the game plan is what we do outside of the basic game system. So we need to have a game plan that is independent of any tactics that we might use for a specific game. For me, that's really simple, that I have basically everything I do is based around read blocking, and that's the starting point for everything that we do. Once we start to study the game, the most important information for the middle blocker starts with is what the setter does in different situations. Traditionally, we talk about the rotation, the setter position, the distribution in each setter position. I am not particularly interested in the distribution except for some outliers from game to, or from rotation to rotation. What I am interested in is what the setter does when they are moving, when the quality of the reception changes, and in combination with different first tempo calls. So if the first tempo is close to the setter or far from the setter, that is the starting point for all of my tactics and the basis of the information that I give to the middles. Something else that we talk about is also in the case of a short setter, how they might react or how they might act in that situation. I'll go into more detail about match planning again in a later webinar. So something else for you to look forward to. I said that I would swing back to this, even though the focus today has been on the blocking part of middle blocking. I want to leave with this point that serve and defense are part of the middle blocker's game, just like everybody else's game, and we need to practice those things just like we practice everything else. Nowadays we're in the past, when I was a junior, everybody would practice the same, and everybody would stand there while the coach belted 50 balls at them, while everybody else stood around and waited. Now we understand that that's a poor way to practice, and certainly an inefficient way to use the time of the team. But there are still things that we can do to help middles get better at serving and defending. The most obvious one is to let them play defense, and maybe might be surprising to some of you that you will see a lot of coaches who don't have their middles play defense. So I've been to many practices, even with famous high-level coaches who have the middle serve while the libero is standing in the court, and the middle doesn't even come into the court to defend that action. Firstly, I have a couple of problems with that. Firstly, it means the serve is not real, because moving to play defense is actually part of the process of serving. And secondly, it's missing an opportunity to play defense. Presumably, the idea is that liberos can practice more, but liberos practice plenty of reception and defense, and sometimes they have to also practice not being on the court, which is part of the libero's action. So middles should practice serving and defense, and even more so, or to continue the theme at least, is even some coaches who let the player let the middle play defense after the serve will then put the libero back in when they put in the extra balls for the wash drill. And again, that's something that I wouldn't say I'm vehemently against, but I've definitely had words with my team in practice when they tried to do that. And sometimes it's because coaches in their past have wanted them to do that. Other times it's because the libero wants to, and the middle, who's been made fun of for years, is more than happy not to play defense and give his teammates a chance to make fun of him. And those are the things as coaches that we have to be aware of and let's say nip in the bud. So as a last reminder, volleyball middle blockers are volleyball players.
Hey, your job is to play volleyball, not to be a middle blocker. It's to play volleyball. All right.
And I should have given the context to that before. The action just before the timeout, the player in question, who I don't need to name because it's right there, actually went and stood underneath the net so that he would not have to receive a free ball that was about to come over the net. So again, that's something that previous coaches had instructed him to do, devised systems of play that he would never have to touch the ball. And I'm happy to say that it's an old video, and the player in question has turned out to be a pretty good volleyball player who happens to be a middle blocker. So I'll say thanks for your attention. I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. There are more to come. You can find them at my website, marklevergy.com. Just click on the top right, webinars on demand. And as time goes on, there'll be a collection of them covering a range of topics. Right now there's already some stuff there on gameplay and communication, and there's some more stuff on the way, at least percolating in my mind. So thanks again for your attention, for your time, and hope to talk to you soon. By all means, contact me on any of the social media platforms that you'll be able to track down in about 2 seconds. So have a good one, and good luck with your teams.